Next speaker is Eliot Brenner.
All right. I want to thank you for inviting me today. It's truly an honor to be here today to pay homage to the work of Alan Kazdin. There's a great line from the movie classic It's a Wonderful Life, where the main character, George Bailey, has an opportunity to look at the world as if he'd never been born. He's heartbroken about all the things that aren't there because he wasn't there to make a difference. At this darkest moment, his guardian angel turns to him and says, "You see, George, each man's life touches so many others." I believe we're all here today because we recognize that Alan's life has touched so many others. And we know that Alan's influence extends far beyond the people in this room. So I was a student of Alan's in the clinical psychology program at Yale from 1990 to 1995. I think, Alan, that was the same tide that occurred in a later photo, but I'm not positive. It looks familiar, but this photo is from 1992. It's from the psychology department brochure, which I actually still have a copy of, believe it or not. So Alan was a reader on my master's thesis, and I had the good fortune to take several of his classes, including those on research methods and psychotherapy. When I arrived at Yale, Alan was one of the clinical psychology faculty members that was spearheading an effort to bridge the gap between research and practice. He believed that graduate students should learn a scientific approach to the study of clinical psychology, and this should be reflected in the ways that they practiced. At the heart of all this was Alan's belief that bringing science to clinical psychology would solve most of the problems for clinical psychologists. To this end, it is true, Alan was legendary in the psychology department for stopping students from his research methods class in the hallways and asking them to define threats to internal and external validity. This induced avoidance behavior in a few students, but for most of us, it pushed us to study and gain a deeper understanding of the scientific method. I know that Alan looks back on this part of his career through a different lens. In an interview I conducted with him for the Children's Mental Health Network in October of last year, he said, "I would like to unpublish my papers about the gap. I would like to unpublish my papers only because I believed at the time that bridging the gap between research and practice was of keen interest. Now I do not think it is, or even ought to be. Needless to say, I am not against bridging. My dentist talks about it all the time, and I believe her when she says bridging is important and saves mouths. I am less persuaded when psychologists, including me, talk about it." This is just one of many inspiring characteristics of Alan. He does not hold fast to those things he no longer believes in. Alan has been a mentor to me for more than 25 years. Although he may make light of his work bridging research and practice, underlying this approach is his belief that the principles of science can make the world a better place to live for those in need. I did not pursue an academic career after graduate school, but one of the things that I took away from Alan while I was in school, and that I've applied in all the places I worked since then, primarily in child welfare and mental health organizations and private foundations, was the need to incorporate a scientific approach to helping organizations achieve better outcomes on behalf of those in need. I'm one of many students that left Alan's tutelage using this approach. Another one, Paul Marciano, is in this room today. Paul and I were graduate students at Yale at the same time. Alan's sitting over there. Between Alan and Paul, their consultation over the last 15 years at the three organizations where I worked shaped the professional development of hundreds of clinicians and changed the lives of tens of thousands of vulnerable, high-acuity children and families. I'm eternally grateful for that, and I suspect these clinicians, children, and families feel the same. The ideas I'm going to share for you today were greatly influenced by Alan's work on the treatment gap, which is the percentage of people who need mental health treatment but don't get it. I spent 15 of my 23 years since graduate school in 2 private foundations, and I believe that closing the treatment gap in children is a problem that private foundations could play a critical role in changing. So as most of you know, in the United States, approximately 80% of children who have a mental health problem do not receive any treatment, much less an evidence-based one. We have psychosocial interventions that are effective, but they only reach a fraction of the children who actually need them. A recent study showed that for children using publicly funded services, only 2% received an evidence-based treatment. At this small, community-based children's behavioral health agency that I run in Connecticut, which provides psychosocial interventions to about 1,500 kids a year, only 8% receive an evidence-based practice delivered with fidelity to the model. So why is this? Well, one of the reasons is that evidence-based practices delivered to fidelity are really expensive. In Connecticut, the Child Health and Development Institute found that the incremental cost of providing one evidence-based treatment, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, cost about $1,900 per child. We provide that treatment at the agency that I run, as well as 5 other evidence-based treatments. Okay, so if we use the Child Health and Development Institute's incremental cost number and do a very rough back-of-the-envelope calculation for the cost of treating all the kids we served last year with an evidence-based treatment, recognizing, of course, that some treatments might be cheaper, some might be more expensive, it would cost an additional roughly $2.6 million a year, which would increase our budget by about 50%. We have about a $5 million budget. And that would require about twice the funding that we currently get from the Department of Children and Families in the state of Connecticut. Okay, I think we know that that kind of funding increase is never going to happen. Affordability is one of those 3 components that the World Health definition uses to define access to care. The other 2 are acceptability and physical accessibility. And there are issues with both of these. I won't go into them in detail here, but Alan, I think, has covered them nicely in his articles. So where does this leave us? Well, as you know, it's not just about the availability of evidence-based treatment for children, it's about the availability of any treatment using the dominant model of service delivery, which is individual therapy. And as I think Alan said nicely in his 2015 paper about addressing the treatment gap, expanding the workforce to deliver treatment with the usual in-person, one-on-one model of care with a trained mental health professional is not likely to have a major impact on reaching the vast number of people in need of services. The increased person power is not likely to provide treatments where they are needed for the problems that are needed and attract the cultural and ethnic mix of clientele that are essential. Okay, so only 1 in 5 children with a diagnosable mental health condition get treatment, and we know that roughly 50% of serious mental illness emerges before the age of 14, and the impact of no treatment can be dire, depending on where you get your data. Suicide is the 2nd or 3rd leading cause of death amongst teenagers. These are sobering statistics, right? But why should private foundations care? What's the overall cost to society of mental illness? Well, mental illness is at the top of most measures of economic burden of non-communicable diseases. Probably many of you are familiar with these data, which are from the 2011 World Economic Forum. The pie chart depicts non-communicable diseases, the effect on aggregate output, or GDP. You can see that mental health, which is depicted in blue, is a non-communicable disease with the greatest impact on output. The authors estimated that mental illness would cost society $16 trillion between 2011 and 2030. So the impact here of not getting treatment is enormous. While the burden of mental illness is staggering, the total spending on it is not. In this chart, the green bars are the spending as a percentage of total health budgets compared to the economic burden of mental illness as measured by 2 measures. One is disability-adjusted life years, which are the red bars, and years lived with disability, which are the blue bars. The bars are grouped by low income, middle income, upper middle, and high income countries. So you can see, if you go over to the left of that the percentage of spending on mental health is minuscule in low income countries. It's generally less than 1%. But even in high income countries, the spending on mental health care as a percentage of the overall health budgets of those countries is grossly inadequate. So what do we have? We have the prevalence of mental illness in children is great. The impact on society is enormous. The overall funding is insufficient, and the dominant service delivery model is not addressing all of the needs. What are funders doing? What is private philanthropy doing? And what are other funders doing to address this problem? Let's take a quick look at the current sources of funding for mental health research. So these data are from a RAND 2016 study of mental health research funders worldwide. The authors looked at, this is kind of interesting methodology, they looked at acknowledgments in almost about 220,000 research publications between 2009 and 2014. They found 1,900 funders that had more than 10 acknowledgments. So you can see the dark countries, the dark shaded ones are the ones that had the most funders. Charities, foundations, and nonprofits represented 39% of these funders, but governments fund the most papers, roughly 2/3, which is not surprising. And not to return to the impact factor idea, but papers funded by charities, foundations, and nonprofits had the highest citation impact, which may suggest that they're funding things that are more innovative, at least according to the academics that are citing one another. And as you can see from the dark brown areas, the U.S. accounted for a large share of 36% of papers and 31% of government, charity, and nonprofit funders. Okay, if we look in the United States at the largest funder of research in children's mental health, the NIMH, we find there's been a 42% decrease in funding for child and adolescent services and intervention research between 2005 and 2015. That's from approximately 52 million to 30 million. At the same time, the overall NIMH budget was flat, and funding for neuroscience and basic behavioral research over that time increased about 28%. Perhaps, I think even more importantly, this $30 million represents about 2.1% of the total NIMH budget of $1.4 billion in 2015. If you look, interestingly, in the UK, the MQ did a survey in 2016 and found a similar dearth of funding for mental health research compared to other diseases. So this is in need of some significant updating. But the most recent study that I found looking at private mental health funders was from 2009. And this is private foundations, and you can see it's heavily weighted to a few. And of course, you won't see Gates really in there yet, but Gates has dwarfed these funders at this point in health. In absolute dollar amounts, foundations average about $2.6 billion a year in giving between 1998 and 2002, and then $3.5 billion in the years 2003 to 2006. So you can imagine Gates has pretty much changed the picture of that over the last 10 years. And just as a percentage of health giving, average annual mental health giving slipped from, in that period on the chart there, from 10.5% to 6.3%, and as a percentage of overall philanthropic giving from 1.9% to 1.3%. So the trend there was clearly down. There are, fortunately, estimates of new philanthropic money coming online in the next decade, and those estimates are sizable. Back there. It wasn't one. If only 5% of the $9 trillion in assets projected to pass from Americans' estates over the next decade were captured by philanthropy, it would create the equivalent of 10 Gates foundations, which would be about $450 billion and would generate, at a 5% payout, about $22.5 billion in grant making annually. So that's a lot of money, and that could do a lot of work to bridge the gap in children's mental health outcomes. So there's a real potential for private philanthropic support to solve problems like the mental health treatment gap in children. There's a tremendous opportunity in the years ahead for private philanthropy to invest in innovative models, many of which were discussed today, to reach the 80% of children who aren't receiving help for their mental health conditions. I think as long as we keep our focus on the needs of these children, I believe that we can close this treatment gap. Okay, I'd like to close my talk by giving, I'd like to close my talk by giving Alan the last word, because his words have been so meaningful to all of us. I asked Alan in my October 2017 interview, when you look back on your 4-decade career, what is one thing you did that you are most proud of and that you feel had the greatest impact on improving children's mental health? And Alan said, I'm most proud of the work that is not known or thought about very much. At my clinic, where we do research, we treat individual families one at a time. To know concretely that the children have improved and families are doing better has been the best of this work. I think in the end, the main professional and personal question for me is, have I helped anyone or made any life a little easier in a complex world? We have extensive data and, more importantly, direct contact with families that demonstrates that families and children are doing better. Knowing this is incredibly meaningful to me. Thank you, Alan, for all you've done for the many children and families you served and for whose treatments you affected, for all the students you mentored and those who you influenced, and for your profound impact on our understanding of mental health, clinical psychology, and health and human behavior. We are eternally grateful to you. Your influence and impact will be felt for generations to come. Thank you.